Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. I will be in your company for the next 45 to 50 minutes. What a week it has been again in South Africa. We saw, of course, ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule attending court proceedings after his warrant of arrest last week. Again, a 200,000 rand bail, and of course his case will be brought back next year. The Bushiris, well, they've decided they wanted to skip South Africa, and now there seems to be a diplomatic tussle between Malawi and South Africa. Who knows what's going to happen with regards to getting the Bushiris back to South Africa for them to account for them leaving while they still were on bail. But that's not our discussion for this week. Our discussion is going to be with regards to the by-elections. For the first time, elections happen during a pandemic. Well, history will record this as being something done for that very first time. The by-elections, of course, taking place last week across 95 wards and 55 municipalities across South Africa. So to discuss this with me, of course, the challenges, how it was able to be done, and of course, looking forward to local government elections, which is going to be happening next year. I have Mr. Masego Sheburi. He is the IEC's Deputy Chief Electoral Officer. Mr. Sheburi, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on Truth to Power.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. No, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Mr. Sheburi, the challenges. It seemed as if, were we ever going to see elections happening during a pandemic? But the IEC has gone ahead and executed it. Just give an idea to the viewers how challenging it was, especially during this time, what we're experiencing right now.
Indeed, there were a number of challenges that at first seemed insurmountable. But working with a number of social partners, including political parties, we were able to put in measures that would ensure that we can hold by-elections, not because we want to hold them, but because we understand that for as long as the vacancies in those wards were not filled, voters in those geographic area would have lost a voice in the municipal council. The first challenge that we needed to get around was whether in the context of the lockdown and the regulations that prescribed against free movement of persons, regulations that did not allow for political party activity, whether in those circumstances you could hold by-elections that were free and fair. The view of the Commission was that for as long as the regulation did not permit for free movement or did not permit for free campaigning by political parties, by-elections held under those conditions could not pass the freeness and fairness muster. The second challenge was to make sure that in holding by-elections, those by-elections activities do not become super spreader events. In other words, what are the measures that we ought to have put in place to ensure that people could vote in relative safely? And again, there we worked with political parties, including the Department of Health, and we derived a number of protocols that we implemented on voting day at voting stations to ensure that while people choose public representatives, they could choose without exposing themselves to harm. So I think in the nutshell, those were the key challenges, making sure that by-elections can happen in a safe environment, but also making sure that contestants would have reasonable access to voters.
And of course, talking about, making sure the safety that was there for some of the voters, when we look at the percentage, 37.83%, of course, compared to the last of 38.73%. The numbers just needed a bit of a turnaround. And then, of course, Port St. John's was one of the highest, turnouts, where 75.29%. That's still a pretty decent number, isn't it, Mr. Sheburi, considering that we are in a pandemic and considering that a number of South African citizens were very wary of going to the polling stations, as you mentioned, the chances of there being a super spreader wherever the polls were.
That's correct. The rate of turnout indicates the level of legitimacy that those who hold elected office enjoy. We had hoped for a much more higher rate of participation, but we are satisfied that the percentage of turnout compares favorably with the percentage of turnout since 2016 by-elections. So we were not too far off the mark while we had hoped for a higher percentage of participation. We do not get a sense that voters were dissuaded from participating because of fear that they may contract the virus. And this is so because having worked with media groups, these by-elections were able to generate a lot of interest that we've never generated hitherto.
And talking about the interest that it needed, of course, you had your 40 parties, your 444 candidates, your 19 independent candidates. That in itself just brought ahead how important this by-election is, especially in the democracy that we live in, and especially, some of the service delivery challenges that are faced, within those wards and municipalities. So again, just the importance of how this by-elections needed to happen, especially during a pandemic.
That's correct indeed. We needed to give voice to communities in those 95 wards to, in a democratic manner, select among all those contesting interest, men and women who were adequately equipped to represent them and their interest in the chambers of those on those municipal councils. And also this affirms that a local government as a sphere of governance is beginning to come into its own, as if you consider that for the past two general elections, we have recorded voter turnout improvement of about 10%. And sadly, in the last general election, we have seen the opposite, in that there was a rate of decline in the participation in provincial and national elections.
Mr. Shaburi, the one concern a lot of people had raised was, of course, the social distancing that was happening. I remember going to some of the polls, speaking to some of the people that went to the by-elections, and of course seeing, from other media houses. So how are the IEC able to go ahead and make sure that social distancing was enforced? Because I know it seems that because we are in lockdown level 1, sometimes, as citizens, we tend to not take it very seriously. But as a Chapter 9 institution, how important was it to make sure that social distancing was enforced, especially in the polling stations, and especially with regards to the sweltering heat that was felt across South Africa?
The primary concern for us was to, one, ensure that by-elections take place in an atmosphere that respects the prevailing lockdown conditions. Secondly, that we put in measures at the voting station, including additional staff and additional signage to assist persons to maintain distance between themselves in queues. But thirdly, we had attempted as far as possible to keep the measures intuitive, in that the measures must not differ too much to what people are accustomed to in their normal everyday life. So from those three considerations, I think we're able, in the majority of cases, to ensure that persons kept safe distances from each other, because the measures were well known to them. We were just reinforcing that which the South African population had become accustomed to.
I'm in discussion with Mr. Masego Shaburi. He's the IEC Deputy Chief Electoral Officer. Join us after the break. We will be continuing the discussion with regards to last week's by-election. Stay tuned. I'm in discussion with Mr. Masego Shaburi, the IEC Deputy Chief Electoral Officer. Mr. Shaburi, what we saw across some of the polling stations, especially in the informal settlements, there was a lot of complaints of a lack of service delivery, and a lot of the IEC volunteers and representatives had complained about it. How were the IEC able to juggle that, especially in areas where a basic need of water was not available?
Elections on their own do not guarantee a democratic experience. Yes. We, as an election management body, are responsible for the procedural element of democracy. In other words, we will delimit voting districts, we will put in voting stations, we will register voters. And once an election has happened, we hope that those who are installed into government deliver the substantive elements of democracy, i.e. the services that they had promised to citizens. And those two, the substantive and the procedural, must coexist so that people feel and remain invested in democracy as a proper form of governance. Without one of the two, a democratic project is placed in peril. On our part, we are happy that we are able to avail facilities for voters to present themselves and to exercise their choice in an unhindered manner, to install men and women that would administer affairs of their country in a manner that accords to their expectation.
Mr. Shaburi, I think one thing that's very interesting, and of course it's as a voter, with regards to local government or national elections, you get different sorts of environments that you can go in and then of course vote, be it town halls, be it school halls. And then of course you've got, areas where it's very, very difficult, especially in the informal settlements. I think that sometimes our viewers don't get an idea of how difficult it is for some of the IEC officials. And maybe you can give an explanation to how difficult and the challenges are for the officials who have to go and work. And they're not working your 8 or your 10 hours. They're working 12 to 24 hours, especially in a by-election where you want the results to come out immediately so that the citizens of the wards or the municipalities will be able to have an idea of which political party is representing them.
Those circumstances are real, and they are sadly a reminder that we remain still an unequal society because in some areas people are able to vote in conditions of dignity. In other instances, a tent is the best that we can offer as an election management body. There are still a number of communities where there are no social amenities, be they school, proper structures. And in those circumstances, the only choice that we have is to erect a tent so that we can bring the right to vote closer to where people are. We have guidelines that says a voter must not travel in excess of, say, 6 kilometers in an urban setting or 12 kilometers in a rural setting, that we should not have a voters roll with more than 3,200 persons. And that speaks to the speed with which we can facilitate the right to vote of those circumstances. So the difficulty that we have there is that, firstly, our staff have to work in very difficult conditions. On the day of the by-elections, there were a number of turns where we had at short notice to make alternative plans to move those voting stations to more permanent structures or to provide additional equipment to make those voting stations habitable, because in some instances, some of those tents were flooded and the circumstances were not ideal. But it is a balancing act between extending the right to franchise and limiting the right of those people to participate because we want to make them vote informalized structures like town halls and schools. So that is the sad reality, that in some instances, we still do not have social amenities. And in our quest to extend the right to vote to those persons, we have to regrettably resort to temporary facilities like tents, because we understand that the right to vote, as the Constitutional Court has put it, is a badge of personhood. It says to those people they matter on that day in spite of their circumstances. We're working increasingly within the finite resources that have been placed at our disposal to improve the quality, even in those temporary voting stations. We are thankful to municipal councils who afford us significant assistance to make sure that we have proper tents, we have water, and we have ablution facilities, even in those temporary sites. But there are instances where we have to start from scratch to provide a temporary toilet, to provide potable water, and to provide a tent as the only facility that people in those communities can use as a voting station.
Mr. Shaburi, for the IEC, do you think that more needs to be done in terms of funding for this institution? Because, of course, we have the local government elections coming next year, and then, of course, in just under 4 years' time, we're going to be having the national elections. I know that we, of course, are in a recession and COVID-19 has wreaked havoc amongst the economy, but do you feel that the IEC would require more funding to make sure that better facilities, not that the ones that you have now, but sometimes maybe even more facilities to accommodate the voters would be needed?
I think to answer that question, we must take it in the context of where the country finds itself in. Treasury has no money at its disposal. There are competing social needs in the country. While we were adequately funded 3 years ago, owing to the hard economic circumstances made worse by the COVID-19, it has become necessary for Treasury to recall some of the resources that it had placed previously at our disposal. We understand that it was a difficult choice on their part. So on our part, we will look at all our programs to see if we could do some things better, if we could rationalize some of our projects that we had planned, so that even with the cards, those cards do not materialize at the level of a voting station, because a voting station still remains the only prism through which people experience the voting process. We are resolved that all the resources at our disposal, meager as they are, will be prioritized so that we can extend convenience to the voting public as and when we hold the elections next year. We are in engagement with Treasury to ask for additional funding where we already foresee a need to bolster some of our activities, and the only way to do so might be by a way of additional resources if National Treasury can find savings elsewhere in the state.
I'm in discussion with Mr. Masego Shaburi from the IEC. To join us after the break, we will be continuing the discussion with regards to the by-elections and looking forward to local government and national elections. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm continuing my conversation with Mr. Masego Shaburi from the IEC. Mr. Shaburi, on December the 9th, there's going to be another round of by-elections for 24 wards. So, just to educate myself and to educate our viewers, what is the difference between the by-elections that happened last week and, of course, the by-elections that's going to be happening next month?
The by-elections that we held on the 11th of November in respect of the 95 wards, we were playing catch-up basically to clear the backlog of by-elections that we could not hold owing to COVID since March 2020. And in terms of the law, a by-election must be held within 90 days from the date of vacancy to fill or to replace a candidate or a councillor who was representing a ward. The by-elections that we're holding in December are those that have become vacant in the intervening period. And we will also have another set of by-elections in Jan as well as in February 2021 to fill vacancies that have arisen recently.
Mr. Shaburi, local government elections, of course, which is going to be happening next year. The local government elections brought a lot of attention back in 2016, of course, when certain municipalities or metros went to a certain respective parties. We know that the pandemic's going to be with us for a very long time, even though there is a vaccine in the works. Taking the lessons from what happened this year with regards to the by-elections, how is the IEC going to take it now to local government elections, which on paper, what we've seen from experience, will be much bigger and there'll be much more of South African citizens going ahead to the polls?
We have drawn significant lessons from these by-elections. The size alone, 95 by-elections in 55 municipalities in 455 voting stations, afforded us an opportunity to draw lessons, one, on the public safety measures that we need to refine in the voting station. Secondly, we have drawn lessons to see whether the public safety measures that we've put in at the voting station, do they prolong the voting process or not? Thirdly, is the level of protection that we must provide to our staff as well as those persons who will be voting by way of special votes. We have also tested our logistics as it relates to new items in our bill of materials, which hitherto we have never had to provide for, i.e. PPE. So we are planning on the basis that COVID will still be a factor in next year's election. And if it is under control, we will then readjust our plans at that date. But on our part of planning, we're planning as though this election, the elections next year will be undertaken under the context of COVID. And as I say, we have drawn a lot of lessons. We can quantify in a few weeks' time the actual spend that will require to put in the necessary level of PPE at a voting station to ensure that both the registration event as well as the voting event can happen without placing people unnecessarily at risk.
Mr. Shaburi, there will always be a dark side to a lot of things where there have been many elections where people have found ballot boxes thrown away or ballot boxes not being counted. And that, of course, brings, the integrity and credibility with regards to the institution. How does the IEC now say we put a stop to all of this and that integrity and credibility remain a core function with regards to the IEC, especially now where, of course, you have the heat up happening between various political parties? So what is the IEC's plan in making sure that the credibility is there and remains and that citizens can trust the IEC to go ahead and do the right thing with regards to the elections and counting each and every vote?
Reputation is key, is very key in election. You don't have to establish fact to cast aspersion on an entity like the Electoral Commission. An allegation alone is enough to cause harm. Let me just restate the following. For all elections, we vote at the station. No ballots are transported from the station before they are counted. So we do not move uncounted ballot papers and ballot boxes. At the close of the station, that station is converted into a counting station where we count in the presence of political party agents who observe the counting process, they can raise objections, and more importantly, they sign off on the result slip that we issue at that voting station. A copy of the result slip is left at the voting station almost as a public notice to say, at this station, these are the results that have been announced at the station. A duplicate copy is transported in a tamper-evident envelope to a local office for purposes of scanning and capturing into the result system. Political parties, again, have access to the same system that we have to track all the results that are scanned as images, to also look at all the results that are captured. Over and above that, we have also inbuilt parameters to safeguard those elections. For example, to say if there's a variance in the support of a political party in a specific voting station, the system must throw out an exception. It doesn't say that result is incorrect, but it says there's a variance that is outside of the tolerable level. Go look at that result slip to check if there's anything untoward. We also have the process of objection. What we have seen increasingly is that the advent of social media has a very good effect on elections, but it also has a very deleterious effect if not used properly. We have found in the past people taking images of previous elections and spreading them as fake news that ballot papers have been found when those ballot papers had been counted and they were, in most instances, they were in our storage or they had been pegged, are waiting for transportation to a disposal site. To that end, we are trying to invest in measures to guard against the use of social media in the election, because you are correct. If people see those images it creates a doubt in their psyche and in their mind that the outcomes are free and fair if people claim that ballots were found where they ought not to have been in the first place. But as a rule, we count at each voting station, and no ballot is transported until we have a result slip signed off by political parties who can observe the counting at that voting station.
Mr. Shaburi, before we go to wrap up this section and, of course, to the next, political party funding. I know that the IEC, and it's something I read just before I came on air for this interview, that it needs to be ethical, it needs to be transparent, and most importantly, there needs to be nothing irregular about it. There's, of course, been a discussion with regards to Parliament to open up political party funding so that us as the citizens can find out who's funding a certain political party. The IEC, of course, wants the same thing. They would like all of the things that I mentioned in terms of the transparency and, of course, the credibility of the political party funding. Just to elaborate, Mr. Shaburi, how important is it that political parties are funded in the right manner in accordance to the mandate of the IEC?
The good thing is that the legislation that regulates political party funding has been signed into law by the president already a year ago. All that is needed is for the date to be proclaimed on which that legislation will take effect. That legislation provides for the avenues of funding. It outlaws certain funding avenues, but it also regulates the disclosure requirements that are placed on political parties, including the threshold and the quantum of the amounts that political parties must disclose. So once that piece of legislation is brought into force, the South African population will be able to track which political party receives funding from which source, and whether political parties have received funding from sources that were not supposed to have received from, and also that on a quarterly basis, the Electoral Commission will then publish the amounts that political parties have received. On our part, we stand ready to give effect to the legislation as soon as the president declares the date on which it takes effect.
Mr. Shaburi, if there is something irregular found with regards to political party funding, is there some sort of criminal charge that could be laid on them, or some sort of penalty that gets hit onto the parties if the IEC does see, right, there's something wrong with regards to the funding of these political parties?
The party funding legislation provides for all those avenues. For one, for the sources from which a party can receive funding, how it must account for those funds, but also that they must have auditors to audit their books, and from then onward disclose the sources of their funding.
I'm in conversation with Mr. Masego Shaburi. After the break, we'll of course be wrapping up our discussion with regards to the by-elections that took place, and of course looking ahead to local government and the national election. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm in conversation with Mr. Masego Shaburi, the IEC's Deputy Chief Electoral Officer. Mr. Shaburi, I know last week that the IEC had rejected Action SA's, of course, appeal for them to be registered as a political party. From what we are hearing, Mr. Herman Mashaba was, of course, the leader of the party. I don't think he's going to let this going down. Whether or not he takes it to the Constitutional Court or the higher powers remains to be seen. But is the IEC ready for any sort of, a reappeal that is going to be coming through from Action SA?
The scheme as it relates to the registration of political parties is as follows. A party makes an application, the Chief Electoral Officer assesses that application, and if it is in terms of the law, he approves the registration of that party. if the registration of a party is not in keeping with the law, the chief electoral officer may not register that party. And if the party is aggrieved by the decision of the chief electoral officer, it may appeal to the commission. That is what has happened in respect to the registration of Action SA. And last week, the commission communicated its decision to the party. We have been in consultation with the political party, and they have indicated that they will submit a new application that we will assess and make a decision known to the political party in not so a distant future.
Okay, because my understanding, Mr. Shapuri, was that it came down to the color scheme of the party. Am I right or am I wrong? Please do correct me if I'm wrong, because that was our understanding, that it was another political party that they had copied. So is it more than just the color scheme of the flag?
The law provides that in registering a political party, the chief electoral officer may not register a party if its name or its logo or any of its primary identifier may cause confusion with an already registered political party. It was the considered view of the chief electoral officer that the color scheme of the logo of Action SA closely resembled the colors of a party that was already registered, to the extent that it may cause confusion among the voters, and voters may end up inadvertently casting ballots for a wrong party.
Mr. Shapuri, I want to take the conversation outside of South Africa. Of course, we saw 2 weeks ago the US elections that took place, and again in a pandemic, and again, of course, the US using institutions like the US Postal Service. From an IEC looking, just outside of it, how did you take the US elections? What was your view on how the US elections were conducted in a much bigger country with a much bigger population, and of course, using services like the US Postal Service? So just, give us an idea from somebody who sits in the Chapter 9 institution, how well, or were there any sort of defects that was picked up with regards to the US elections?
Obviously, we draw lessons from a number of jurisdictions in making sure that the measures that we put in place to administer elections in the context of a pandemic are adequate from a health perspective. We have drawn lessons from jurisdictions like South Korea, like France had their local government elections in the context of a COVID. Israel had their elections, as well as the United States of America. The only difference is that in the majority of those jurisdictions, they have what we call, as you correctly point out, postal voting. We do not have that in our scheme of elections. And for purposes of 2021, we are preparing on the extant law as it stands. We will not have postal voting. What we do have, though, is an ability for persons who are unable to go to a voting station to present themselves on the day of election, to apply for, and if approved, to vote by way of special vote. In this immediate past by-election, just under 4% of all persons who voted by way of special vote, i.e. people who were unable to physically attend to a voting station, or persons who knew ahead of time that they will not be in their voting district on voting day, and therefore they apply for special vote. For those who vote at the station, we will persist with arrangements to make sure that we have adequate levels of PPE to safeguard our staff as well as the voting public. Similarly, when you go into communities to administer special vote, we also provide heightened levels of PPE so that if we encounter a person who may have been infected by the virus, they do not transmit it to our staff, but also that if any of our staff members may be a carrier, they do not transmit it to a member of the voting public.
But what impressed you about the US elections, Mr. Shapuri? I mean, just looking at it, of course, it took quite a long time for that to be counted, but it was very effective, wasn't it?
Shall I reserve a call on a sister EMP?
Yes, not a problem. We can definitely reserve it for that. Mr. Shapuri, the IEC, talk to us about the importance of it, because I'm going to go back historically to that day of April the 27th, 1994. I was still very, very small at that time. how important is the IEC in South Africa? And when people say Electoral Commission, but they don't really look at the word independent and the independence of this institution, especially for citizens who go to the polls and vote and make their voices heard with regards to be it a tick, be it a thumbprint, whatever the case may be, the power of elections. Give us an explanation to how important it has been for the IEC to be in a democratic South Africa.
There are various iterations of electoral commissions. In the context of South Africa, the Constitution made a conscious choice that ours will be an independent institution in terms of Chapter 9, that will be independent of government. It will exist independent of the state for two reasons. So that in its management of elections, it can be functionally independent from the state, so that you deal with perceptions that the IEC is being managed or is being directed from the executive. Secondly, is that for a country in transition, you needed to reassure the South African population that the elections will be free and fair, not just in word, but also in action. Thirdly, you need an independent electoral body that registered voters in a non-partisan way, i.e. that we go and put as much effort in Chicken Farm as we do in Dunkeld. We put as much effort in Guguletu as we do in Bishop's Court. So for a country in transition, you needed that reassurance that an independent body will administer elections. And in the word of the Concord, in one of the many judgments that it made on the work of the Electoral Commission, it said the right to vote is a badge of personhood. It says on that day, every one of us matter in spite of our circumstances. So we can't overemphasize the independence, the functional independence of an election management body.
Mr. Masego Shaburi, thank you so much for making the time for us here on Truth to Power. Long may the IEC reign in South Africa, as we truly do need it, not just as a Chapter 9 institution, but of course an organization that allows South Africans to go ahead and vote in either be the by-elections, the local government elections, of course, and the national elections. We thank you so much for joining us. That was Mr. Masego Shaburi, the IEC Deputy Chief Electoral Officer. Of course, just discussing the by-elections and looking ahead to local government elections next year, and of course the national elections that are going to be happening in 2024. Well, that's all we have time for you here on Truth to Power. But this is one thing I want to leave you with. There were scenes yesterday at the SABC, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is that they are our fellow media colleagues. And for 400 people to be retrenched, that really does hit it deep into the heart. And it's not just media workers, it's not just, people that sit behind the camera, do the vision mixing, do so many things. It's people who have to provide for their families. And what we saw yesterday with regards to so many of the workers standing up for their fellow colleagues really brought a lot of emotions to myself, to see that, there are people that are willing to stand with each other during these difficult times. And the SABC, of course, retrenching 400 people will have a detrimental effect on so many livelihoods. So, from myself, Faraz Patel, I stand in solidarity with so many of our fellow media colleagues that are going through these difficult times. We hope that there can be a solution. We hope that the 400 workers can keep their jobs, because with retrenchments, with the unemployment rate that is so high in South Africa, we cannot afford to have more people on the unemployment line. You just have to go to the South African Post Office and see the people that are going ahead and collecting the 350 Rand COVID-19 relief grant. It's only going to last until the end of January, and we cannot afford for there to be more unemployment that is going to be happening in South Africa. So we hope that the government can make sure that they can find a way, because there are certain institutions that need to be kept in South Africa. So the solidarity is not just for our media colleagues, but it's for them and their families all together. And we hope that more people will not be unemployed. So from myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the Truth to Power team, enjoy the rest of your evening, enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you again, same time, same place. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.